Before I start this video, I will say that this time around, there are a few brief mentions of sexual abuse, predatory behavior, and suicide that are made by ER and me, but only in response to ER. So if you see a red exclamation point at the top right of the video, like this, it means that I'm giving approximately 2 seconds before any of these topics show up by us. While only a few of them go into detail, and even then it's not by much, for those that do go into detail, I'm not taking any chances, as I, indeed, care about the mental wellness of my audience. Thank you and enjoy the video. Okay, here we go. ER is not a bad reviewer. When it comes to reviewing stuff, he's not bad. I specifically think that his Death Note review has good analysis, though his Legend of Korra review isn't too bad either. I may not like these personally, but I will not call them bad reviews. Hey everybody, Freezing Climber here. You might be wondering why I said these things immediately before introducing myself. Well, there's a few reasons. First off, my first video on Steven Universe has aged horribly, and it's not representative of my modern work in terms of quality, so I'm remaking it. Also, the consistent death threats and hate comments I get from this video made me want to become Spinel. Speaking of, second off, my channel has grown a bit compared to when I first started, and it means that now I have a consistent audience. I'm not as afraid to post this video and have people talk about it. Third off, I completely forgot how controversial ER was in general, especially at the time of making that video. For those not in the know, PewDiePie shouted him out in a video of his, as a good reviewer in general. However, this was when there was that whole media sting about trying to see PewDiePie in the worst light possible, and that led to a lot of people talking about how ER uses Nazi imagery to say that PewDiePie endorses it by comparison. Alright, first things first, it's a very charged statement to call him a Nazi. Like I said in the original video, he said a bunch of Nazi things, and made a lot of Nazi jokes. But that doesn't directly translate to him being a Nazi. He's probably just edgy, or at least that's what I think it is. Either way, it's not for me, and keep it as far away from me as possible. Second off, but maybe I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. I'm going to structure this video by talking about the most important points in the original video that I agree with, and then some extended thoughts on the feedback that I got from others. The entire point of my original video is to say that ER's video should be taken as humor and not episode 73 or 74 when making the original video, which should demolish any hopes of taking this point seriously. The fact that he couldn't make it through the entire show at the time, that being 2 seasons, without quitting, isn't something I'm putting against him personally though. He's free to like and dislike as much as he wants, but there's also the fact that there are 3 more seasons, a movie, and a sequel series that aren't accounted for with this vid. Obviously they didn't come up around the time that he was making the video, but using ER's video now is pretty stupid. His first main point is about why the gems fight other gems, when in episodes like Ocean Gem and The Return talk about the corruption of the gems. Not to mention, as soon as episode 8, gem battlefields are mentioned, and the gem war is talked about in episode 45. He then talks about how nobody is concerned about the damage of the gems until now, which falls flat until you realize that they don't have to. In Historical Friction, it details how the crystal gems went around everywhere protecting people from corrupted gems. And in Story for Steven, it shows that they didn't have any interaction with the world beyond the fence until Greg, and more specifically Steven, came along. Both of these points have one thing in common that dragged down its credibility in terms of taking it seriously. It's not backed up at all. Yet people take this video seriously. Obviously he shouldn't have to do a point-by-point debunk if he really doesn't want to, which is why he didn't. He doesn't even really go into that much detail with a lot of these. How many times do you think I could say that this is a satirical video that was explicitly satire that shouldn't be taken seriously? You know what? Next time I wonder how people can actually take this video seriously, I'll post that clip of Bismuth screaming in lava. He says that the show follows a formula, and in listing the steps, first there's a problem, either Steven is sad, the gems are sad, or there's an alien threat. Second, Steven suggests a solution and the gems disagree. Then they meet in between or use Steven's solution and then live happily ever after. He also says that this show is almost as formulaic as Phineas and Ferb, but that it doesn't do as much subversion from the normal plot. I did some looking around to find that it was less than a third of the episodes that follow his criteria. Overarching story bad, and how not much has been done in it. And while that's true, there's also the fact that this only accounts for the first 1.5 seasons, so bleh. Art bad, but he concedes that the art behind the show is not to his taste, but that it is indeed subjective overall. Voice acting bad, specifically bringing up how Garnet can't emote. And like, she can emote as well as someone like Skips from Regular Show, or Raven from Teen Titans. And despite all three of them not really having that big of a vocal range as other characters do, these members are more stoic and more serious, meaning that they have an in-character reason to not do so. Music bad, cause it's either decent, ripping off classic Disney, or ukulele hipster music. Of course he doesn't mention any good songs because SU bad, but whatever. Saying that it rips off classics would have been much better, considering that Rebecca Sugar writes songs for both. They're also wildly different because, while classic Disney films use more orchestral music, shows like Adventure Time and Steven Universe have songs that utilize more digital instruments, or usually only have 1 or 2 instruments. Speaking of 1 or 2 instruments, I wonder if people take that hipster music comment as anything other than world building bad, because the names of the worlds in the show are bad. And while that is true, that doesn't prove that hypocrisy meme. So gee golly gosh, it's almost like then these clips are played in succession to elaborate on it.
Rose Quartz believed all life was precious and worth protecting.
Wow! They were doing something awful to the planet, and your mother couldn't stand it anymore. She told me that's why she had to turn on her own kind. Why?
Which is funny because they're talking about Rose. It doesn't necessarily mean that world building bad. Also, there's the fact that he reveals why gems are fighting other gems with these clips. That being, them doing bad things to the Earth, specifically shown on the Run, and the origin of the gems. He then says that nothing has come from the cluster, which, when was it revealed? And how far has he seen? Not to mention, it's funny how something coming from the cluster was actually the season immediately after the one that he stopped, in the first episode. So again, it was relevant at the time, but not now. But what are you gonna do? And then there's this part. So if there's one thing that I look back on my previous video and regret, is that I didn't really give this part much attention as I needed to. Of course I talked about and debunked the big thing, but there were a few points that I needed to get into. In fact, there was one point that I glossed over, which actually fell as the crux to this whole conversation. Before I go forward with this, the line behind definitely tell that they're jokes, and others where you can't. But let's take this one at a time. First, humans are lesbians because they present themselves as women, without having the biology of women per se, while being in love with one another. But he makes it seem like it's such a confusing concept to handle that it's mind-boggling. Like, imagine someone playing through Cave Story or Mega Man and trying to wrap your mind around the fact that there are characters who present themselves as men or women without having all the biological factors that men or women have. Or heck, even opening Siri and trying to find out her gender. If you somehow find this joke relatable, then... But otherwise, this joke kinda snowballs into the rest of his video and makes a weird conclusion. The main one being that fusion is sex, because they do provocative poses when dancing with one another, which leads to the conclusion that Pearl blanked Garnet. I'm not saying the actual word, because I'm tired of saying the word. When talking about Steven Universe, it comes up so much. Let me be clear, the provocative poses are the only explanation that he provides to this, and yet... Well, let's get real deep into this. Actually, we can't, because it's pretty shallow. Doing something provocative doesn't mean that you want to do something explicit. For example, if one person is mad at another and says, "I'm gonna kill you for this," it doesn't explicitly mean that they want the other guy murdered. If someone goes to a club wearing provocative clothing or dancing provocatively, it doesn't mean that they immediately want to do something explicit. Or, a more apt comparison, if someone makes a few provocatively edgy jokes, it doesn't automatically mean that they explicitly follow the beliefs signaled by the edgy jokes. Lastly, there's the fact that fusions are better descriptors of relationships, and many different kinds too, as they're made when gems want to do something together. Steven and Connie fused because of their mutual friendship, and the first time it was done, they had a whole night out, jumping into the ocean, eating donuts, and going to a rave. Jasper and Lapis fused because Jasper wanted the power to destroy the gems, along with Lapis wanting to take her anger out with a bad coping mechanism while saving Steven. Ruby and Sapphire stay as a permafusion because their romantic love knows no bounds. Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl fused when meeting Connie's parents for the first time, so that Steven could keep up Connie's lie. Garnet and Amethyst fused initially to destroy a tower, even though they became aggressive in doing so. Because of that, Garnet chose Pearl to fuse with in order to destroy a tower in front of Amethyst. The Rubies fused because it's their job to do so. And, to address a comment that I got in one of my other videos, the Topaz's reasons for fusing is because it's their job to do so, and while they do have romantic feelings for one another, in SU Original, it's not allowed to be anything more than a workplace relationship by people like Aquamarine. Maybe it takes on different meaning later in the series, after their introduction, but in said introduction, it's just cause their job is to do so, though they want to start something more. Replacing any of these with sex is a stupid thing to do, and it kinda destroys everything and anything that the show tries to do positively, aka giving a bad faith interpretation of what the show tries to do. Heck, there's also the fact that the two articles he uses it as a running joke in his videos. So, for those who have seen my original video, this seems like the place to end it off, mostly. But we have to talk about the crux of this conversation, even though I really don't want to. It's time to talk about gender. You see, I skipped over at this point in the original cause, well, I didn't really get it. Like, I stand firm on the fact that even if one scientist guy in the past did something bad, it doesn't mean that the entire field is bad. And I also stand firm that this is anti-SJW propaganda, but I'll get to why that is later. However, he takes this part so seriously that I can say with 95% certainty that this is not a joke, and this becomes a problem because it's not a good point. First off, he claims that gender in layman's terms is what you believe your sex is, but we need to be careful here. Using the terms gender and sex interchangeably may or may not cause some problems along the line. So, to clarify, sex refers to biological identification, and gender refers to social or cultural identification, as his definition that he got states. As an example, sex characteristics for males include having male genitalia, or not having breasts, or going through a testosterone-based puberty, and so on, because it's what is associated with being a man in terms of biology, while gendered characteristics of men include not wearing dresses, or having facial hair, or talking in a deep voice, because these things are what is associated with being a man in terms of societal or cultural convention. There are a few cases in which they intertwine. I mean, having a male puberty makes it more likely for you to have body hair or facial hair, but they, in no way, mean that they're the same in all aspects. To make it super simple, looking at someone's naked body and inspecting their no-no spots or their genealogy is identifying someone with sex in mind, whether their anatomy represents male or female anatomy. Looking at someone walking down the street and seeing how they present themselves is identifying someone with gender in mind, whether they look like a man or a woman. Speaking of causing a problem down the line, boom. He says that the brain being biological means that there can't be any separation between your mental state or your biology, and therefore gender and sex are interchangeable, which is stupid, especially considering that you can disprove this even without factoring sex or gender in. It's the reason why phantom limbs exist. Even though you may believe you have an arm, your biology may say otherwise if it was destroyed. But with it, there have been studies that distinguish that the brains of trans and cis people align with the gender that they identify as, and they've been as old as 1995 and recent as 2013 and 2014. He then talks about John Money and his theory that someone can be socialized into being a girl if they were originally a man, but then attributes that to him believing that there are no innate differences between males and females, which goes against the concept of biology. You see how the gender argument gets dragged into sex again? But then he talked about the story of David Reimer, almost startlingly serious. And I give him credit for telling the story almost entirely correct.
Upon birth, David lost his willy during the penile mutilation ritual, and so Money found the perfect opportunity to swoop in and perform a bout of human experimentation. He had the infant boy's testicles lopped off, replaced it all with an artificial vagina, and then had the parents raise David to be a girl while undergoing hormone treatments. Furthermore, he had David, as a young child, imitate sex acts with his twin brother, to normalize David as a bottom. Money even had the brothers undress and engage in genital inspections, which he took a photograph of on at least one occasion. Money described the experiments as successful, though David never ended up identifying as a woman and described his visits with Money as traumatic. But whatever, close enough. Except that in adulthood, David's brother killed himself by ODing on antidepressants, and David later shot himself in the head with a sawed-off shotgun.
You're always going to see people that are going to say, well, the Dave Reimer case could have been successful. I'm living proof, and if you're not going to take my word as gospel, because I've lived through it, who else are you going to listen to?
But there are a few things to point out. First off, John Money himself. While he is attributed to the creator of terms like gender, those names, similarly to how Greek philosophers questioned the state of being, despite the state of being existing for centuries. As proof, third genders have existed in Hawaii, India, and Native American culture before the term gender identity ever came into play. According to the American Psychological Association, the same can be said with transgender people, and while his introduction of these concepts have moved forward discussions on gender, there are a few forward psychoanalysis discussion, but things like the psychosexual stages that he pushed are less than correct in hindsight. Let's also be clear here, ER is right about this ever been done. But the main problem with what Money talked about in terms of the discussion of gender, and not the fact that he forced kids to do things sexually provocative, was how he believed that gender could be taught, essentially. He believed that gender could be taught and wasn't innate. The things that John Money do are not at all representative of the current gender movement, not doing those things to kids, nor the fact that he believed you can teach someone to be a certain gender. In fact, looking through this case, it disproves both John Money's conclusions and ER's conclusions. To reiterate it, David Reimer was someone who was taught and brought up through his life that he was a woman, and by all accounts biologically, he was made to be a woman. Because of this, he had gender dysphoria, as he was being raised and treated like a biological woman, despite feeling like a man. Because of this, he had surgery done to revert female changes in his body and lived as a man, marrying a woman and being the father to 3 of her kids. In fact, stories came out about how he never truly felt like a woman, despite the fact that, by all accounts, he was going through a female puberty. This entire thing pushes forward the message that gender is indeed a concept that exists, and that it exists differently from sex. The fact that ER thinks parents not supporting him, his brother overdosing and dying, unemployment, and David's wife wanting a separation, all things that he refused to bring up, instead of just gender forced on him, is massively screwed up. Like, to be fair, David's parents both attribute John Money's methodology as responsible for their sons' deaths, which is definitely probable with the experiments proposed by Money, but the fact that David threatened suicide if he ever saw Money again, the fact that Money's experiment failed, and the fact that David Reimer was able to change the gender he was assigned, shows exactly how gender is important, just not in the way that Money initially thought.
To this day, there isn't a single shred of evidence supporting the existence of gender.
Okay, first off, these two aren't opposing viewpoints, as being a social construct doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. As an example, money is also a social construct, as we, as a society, constructed the concept of a dollar's value. Of course, there's a level of arbitrarity. I mean, telling a caveman that this green piece of paper is worth as much as 4 metal discs and can be exchanged for food, they'd see that as weird. But we, as a society, accept the system in order to progress said society. Also, it seems like this meme is confusing gender with gender identity. It's like having the same meme, but with people can change from being poor to being rich, and money is a social construct. Second off, not a single shred of evidence, huh?
In humans, or the rest of the animal kingdom for that matter.
Well, no shit. Of course being transgender doesn't change sexual reproduction, you knob. How many times do we need to teach you this lesson, old man? Gender and sex are not. It seems that gender and sex are the same thing, then clownfish exist, changing from male to female when the time is needed. There are also recorded cases of chickens, butterflies, and lobsters that are intersex. Female spotted hyenas have pseudo-penises, which enable them to act more similarly to men. But if we aren't, and remembering that gender and sex aren't the same, carriers, colobus monkeys, and cuttlefish. As for humans, well, Cornell University actually did a massive meta-analysis on gender transition documentation from 1991 to 2017, with 55 studies in total. 51 studies point to the fact that gender transition has a positive effect on the mental health of transgender people, 4 reported mixed to no effect, and none of them pointed to any negative effects on the mental health. None of this could be seen if gender as a concept didn't exist.
So remember kids, when you use the term gender, you're using the unproven terminology of a mad scientist who happily committed human experimentation, tortured a pair of twin boys, and drove them both to suicide, and got away with it.
Another lie, unfortunately. While he was known for his his theories on gender and gender identity, the unsuccessful David Reimer case spread more availably, and Reimer's side of the story is more notable. Even in that article you cited, they talk about the awful experimentation John Money did, but acknowledges that gender studies couldn't have moved forward without him. And then it just continues on as if that whole spiel didn't happen. And I know you expect the silly bismuth drowning in lava clip, but aside from the continuation of this, I don't know if I can take this as a joke. It's definitely a serious point that people use against the concept of gender doesn't exist, and not even as a normal video, but on one in a series called Debunked, where he goes into, or at least gives the impression of going into, the nitty-gritty stuff. Then again, there's a lot of benefit of the doubt that we can give ER here, because these points, and a lot of the gender jokes he made, are a product of their time. You see, before 2017 or 2018, especially with the introduction of Gamergate into online spaces, there were a lot of jokes and memes making fun of the left, from assuming gender, to being triggered, to checking privilege, to identifying as an attack helicopter. These were initially made to make more and more information came out, and more information was spread, it became clear how hurtful this was, and not just in an extremist sense. As an example, the triggered meme minimized those with PTSD and trauma by turning it into a joke. Identifying as an attack helicopter meant lumping in both transgender people and otherkin as if they were the same in terms of ridiculousness, minimizing trans rights and non-binary rights. Assuming gender perpetuated the snowflake narrative, and attributed it to the left, making them seem weak and trivial. Checking privilege did the same, but for minority spaces as well. The main problem with all of this is that it disguises punching down as punching up, by talking about elite activists on the left who are far superior to those below them. As it's evolved, it's punching more than those elites, especially when things like LGBT rights and minority rights were being minimized a lot more. But then again, a lot of them were disguised as memes, and they are used primarily as jokes by the majority, while hiding the true origins and intentions of said incident. As an example, the Sonic Twitter didn't see it as transphobic when The Amazing World of Gumball directly calls out how this is a bad faith talking point when checking privilege. Along with that, it actually belittles any of these discussions when going into these topics because they're memes. Because of this, giving ER the benefit of the doubt is pretty easy to do with this case, but the rest of this video could be considered a product of its time too, making fun of the LGBT and general progressivism. I could say something similar for Easy Peasy's video, because despite the fact that it's indoctrination, I can still refer to this as a product of its time, though I'd rather not visit that time ever again. Well, it could have been, if he didn't release the more recent videos reiterating some of this stuff. And as for the gender stuff, it's probable that he was just misinformed, to which I hope this video helped, and if not, then I'm sorry for wasting your time. And this applies to everyone. Speaking of, out of any video I've ever made, this one has gotten the biggest dislike to learn about ER's original video. I need to ask, what did I do wrong? I have a few theories. The primary one is that a lot of people saw my video and thought that it came across as negative, or that what I was trying to say was trying to tear down ER. I assume that it's only because of the title though, and I'll explain why. First off, disliking content does not mean I dislike him. I never said in the video, and that alone. I've never met him, and I even talked about Poe's Law and how it was a problem in regards to looking at that specific video. I prefaced my discussion of the video with the statement that the video wasn't intended to be taken seriously, and was a joke video first and foremost. He makes several statements towards that fact, and the fact that people actually take it seriously is what I was trying to debunk in the first place. The reason I did it, that being for the people who still see validity. You see, there are people who still take this video seriously, the one deleted by ER himself, and used only for jokes, because too many people saw this as serious criticism. Heck, there are people who say, ER still had some valid points though. To both of those types of people, that was what I made this video for. Disregarding anyone's opinion on him or the rest of his work, this video was not made to be taken seriously, and should not be taken seriously. Then there's the fact that I talked about positive stuff about his content before. The first few lines of this video are what this next part is about. That being that I don't even hate his content to begin with, nor do I necessarily find it bad critique. I mentioned this in my previous video and everything. Heck, I made it my whole point to do so, and recommend other videos of him. Then there's the fact that they were maybe judging a book by its cover, with the fact that I mentioned everything, from Poe's Law, to my recommendation of his other content, to the fact that this was a joke video. Geek is invalid because I said so. It's time to bring up one final thing that I mentioned in my video, that being judging a book by its cover, and how wrong it is to do so. I did through the video yield a different result, as it goes out of its way to talk about how it's a joke video, because people didn't think so. He got a lot of hate comments, and had to take the video down later on. I also did this to discuss people judging the entirety of a fandom for the actions of a few. Virtus Joe did an awesome video on this, so I'd say check it out.
People typically think specific fandoms as a whole are toxic because of these legendarily terrible instances, but like I said before, they simply aren't toxic. It's these outliers in the fandom that are. You kinda can't escape shitty people, and they'll literally be everywhere until the end of times. Like my friend Leia says here, toxic people exist in every workplace, internet space, etc. Stop using shady people as an excuse to go after and talk down on people who are part of a certain fandom.
Now, I could talk about it in regards to people looking at the thumbnail and commenting just cuz, or disliking it just cuz, or sending death threats just cuz. My second theory is that they just didn't like the video, and you know what? That'd be fair enough. But I don't have any comments indicating that this is the case, so it would be unlikely. My final theory is that they may just hate me, and the gender part I added to this video isn't gonna help out. Now that this video is done, I never want to see this video ever again. If you like it, it's fine, but it's not my cup of tea, and the fact that people take this video seriously, even though it was mostly satire and treated itself as such, except for, I guess, 2 instances, is awfully ridiculous. Okay, I might do a Steven Universe video some other time, but what else can I make a video about? Maybe it'll be time